Spoilers for the end of Beastars, obviously. This is the last of these videos I'll be doing, so if you like them, check out my books, but we'll talk about them later. For now, let's get to the video. I'm not playing around here. This series has a terrible ending, and seeing as they have decided to release Season 3 in 2 parts, I'm also annoyed, seeing as I know the ending from the manga, but that will not release for a while. So I've just decided to release this now anyway, because I want all of my Beastars videos together. They must be together. That means that I will spoil the end of the world of Beastars, but I won't be going into many specifics. Before I start, once again, this is based off my MA dissertation about Beastars, so that is out there if you want to read it. Let's move on. So, it is very obvious from the very beginning of the manga and anime, from the first 2 seasons already, that Legacy and Haru are going to wind up together. That is pretty much a set in the stars thing. We also know that, seeing as this isn't some realist narrative, the good guys will obviously win. The big bads lose and the good guys win. That is not a spoiler, that's just how stories like this work. However, that personal narrative is not what I care about here. The problem is not with the end of Legacy's story, and I won't go into the end of Louis' story at all, but rather with the end of the world that we see. This does not mean an apocalypse, but rather how the world is portrayed once we have reached the story's conclusion. With a world like this, which has such a terrible relationship with meat, we would probably assume that something has to be done about it. And here is where I will give a bit of a spoiler in terms of the end, and that is that the black market gets torn down. This is a logical thing for the story to do if it wants to be more idealistic, and it certainly is an idealistic story. Legacy does not have the power to end the black market or the carnival's desire for meat, but he did have an influence. Therefore, he finishes the narrative by entering into a life of domestic bliss. He gets to be with Haru, and we even know from one of the Beast Complex spin-off chapters that he and Haru remain together after the conclusion of the story. That's nice. But the world must also change. If there is something terrible in a fictional world, it must be changed on a systemic level if we are to have any hope of it rectifying. Beastars makes an attempt at this. It wants to have a fix for the meat problem. To leave the whole issue of meat just laying there would be to open up questions like, so carnivores just go on eating people after the story ends? Nothing gets better? They don't all, as a society, reject meat altogether? The status quo of this world was that herbivores and carnivores lived in a strained peace with one another because of the facilitation that the black market allowed. It was a means for carnivores to safely get their meat cravings satiated while not having to resort to murdering people to eat them. It was not a good solution, but it was the one that kept things going. And this is also explicitly given as a purpose in the narrative. When Bill the Tiger explains how the world functions, he says that it can only work because carnivores get to eat meat in the black market. Then they don't have to kill and eat any herbivores who are still alive. This is the proposed societal function of the black market. It allows the carnivores to live alongside herbivores without giving in to their base desires. So what happens when it gets torn down? Here's where I have to stop. I have to talk about the Carni-Herbie War and the ocean instead. I know it may seem random, but the war and the ocean are very important. So, let's first start with the war. We are only really told about this old war in brief segments. We learn that there was strife between these two races, for lack of a better word, and the war ultimately came to an end because a whale appeared and appealed to their better natures. So it ended for weird and vague reasons. Anyway, in the aftermath of that war, the society we see in the narrative is formed. Herbivores and carnivores live side by side, and carnivores can no longer hunt and eat meat and must instead reel in their desires for the sake of a functioning society that accepts everyone. The ending of the war has become kind of mythologized, even though it doesn't seem to have been very long ago in terms of the narrative. It's all a bit strange, but anyway, that's how modern society formed in the world of Beastars. The old ways of the carnivores in which they could eat meat more freely are gone, and they have to conform to a society that does not really accommodate them or their particular needs. Here's where the ocean comes in, and the whale is associated with that, so hold on to your britches, I don't know. Anyway, the ocean is introduced in more tangible ways following the end of the murderer arc. Legacy is now living out in the world and has a job, and he comes to meet sea creatures, and he learns their way of life. And that way of life is very different to what he is used to on land. For instance, clothes are not a thing in the ocean, and so when he meets his new friend, who immediately strips once they are indoors, he finds it shocking. However, it's not all about clothes. The way of life in the ocean is kind of Taoist. It's a very go-with-the-flow kind of existence. Everyone knows that everyone else is possible food. They do not have the same reverence for life as land animals, and the idea of a distinction between carnivores and herbivores is non-existent. They all simply live their lives and know that they could be eaten at any point. They all freely hunt one another and all accept this. There are no hard feelings felt toward the one who has killed and eaten you or your loved ones. They have a much more serene view of life and death and view all as a cycle. They may die, but in their death they feed another. This is a philosophy of life that requires all to feel the same way, and that's why the ending does not work. You see, we are mostly exposed to the existence of land animals, and we hardly see the ocean. On land, there are strong divides, and when the black market falls, that same whale, who is somehow still alive, and a major player in the world, introduces us to the idea of the fish sausage. He claims that because sea creatures have a fundamentally different view of life, that they won't care about being killed and turned into sausages and shipped off to the land. They don't see life and death like land animals do, and that is true. They don't see it like land animals, but that's because they don't have the same philosophies of life and death. So, if we suddenly introduce something completely new to their way of life, we actually change that relationship. Before, sea creatures freely ate one another, but all understood that this was a free-for-all. However, that changes when one side starts to hunt and farm without being part of that reciprocal relationship. The fundamentally spiritual relationship that sea creatures have with one another becomes commodified. The land creatures do not have the same level of respect for life and death. They are not in danger of also becoming food. They are simply transferring where they get their meat from the land to the ocean. The philosophy of life and death that the sea creatures have requires all to be on board, and we're even shown in one of the spin-off Beast Complex chapters that a sea creature would prefer that a fellow sea creature eat them than a land creature. We are shown that it would be better for a sea animal to eat a sea animal than a land animal to eat a sea animal, and that's because that sea animal will have respect for who they are eating. This is something that land animals do not possess. Carnivores on land do not have that sense of respect. To introduce this idea of the fish sausage is to allow for the exploitation of the ocean at the hands of the land creatures. It would fundamentally change the relationship between the land and the sea. Those in the ocean would likely grow resentful of those who are killing and eating them with no sense of respect. They are simply plucking ocean life from the seas and consuming them with no regard for them at all. This shows a very troubling misunderstanding of different cultures. If a person believes that we are all destined to die and that death is not the end of existence, that does not mean you should be allowed to kill that person. However, I am going to cut Itagaki some slack here. I mean, how do you change this world? The black market falls and its demise is played as a lovely thing because regular people tore it down. Both carnivores and herbivores worked together to bring it down. That is great, but what about the aftermath? What happens when this generation is dead? The biological needs of the carnivores do not go away simply because one generation of carnivores realized that the black market was wrong. In the real world, humans do not have biological cravings for meat. Raise someone as a vegan and they will not crave meat. However, every carnivore in Beastars is essentially raised as an ovo-lacto vegetarian. They eat dairy, eggs, and insect flour. However, they still yearn for meat. They desire it on a primal level, and you can't easily change instincts like that. You can change it, but not easily. The character of Legacy is a good example. He essentially becomes the Beastars equivalent of a vegan for the most part. However, despite his convictions to never eat a fellow person, he did still yearn to do so. He wanted to eat meat and had to teach himself to resist it. Even someone who never intends to consume meat in this world may desire it. The problems of this world are not the same as the problems in our own, and this is a further reason why you cannot see the world of Beastars as being allegorical for human groups. So, the fish sausage ending would not work. It is shown as being a potentially good solution, but it's a terrible one. And that's how the narrative ends. We don't see how the fish sausage rollout would even work, and we don't see if there would be any issues with it. That means we can only really speculate, and I, for one, do not think that it would work. However, I will say that I do like the personal ending for Legacy. It's ultimately a happy one, and that's good for him. He deserves it. I do find it disappointing that the last 2/3 of this narrative basically move away from the love angle and move more toward a more typical shonen-style narrative. But at least it does ultimately end on a more positive note like this. And that is my argument for why the ending of The World of Beastars is not a good one. It will not work, but do you agree? Disagree? Tell me in the comments if you so desire, and you can also do the liking and subscribing if that seems like your jam. So this is the last of the more formalized Beastars videos that I'm planning to do. Otherwise, I will also recommend one of my books. This time, I think I'll recommend Forceful Mercies and 99 Other Poems. It is a poetry collection, if the name didn't tell you that already. And it's mostly my musings. Check it out. Otherwise, have a great day /week/month ahead.